I heard my housegirl scream inside the cabin, and what I found froze my blood. It was a quiet morning, the kind that usually felt comforting and safe. The sun had just started to rise, spilling warm golden light across the small town where he lived. His house was large, sitting a little away from the main road, surrounded by trees and the soft hum of nature. Birds sang in the distance, and the wind gently rustled the leaves. But on most days this silence was peaceful. But today it seemed to carry a strange weight, a quiet hint that something was not quite right. He had always considered his house to be a place of calm and order. It was not luxurious, but it was tidy and well kept. A small wooden cabin stood at the back of the property, slightly hidden behind the trees. Bah. It was used mostly for storage, though over the years it had taken on a slightly mysterious air. Tools, old furniture, and boxes of things long forgotten filled its interior. For the most part, it was harmless, a place people rarely thought about. But somehow, that morning, his eyes kept drifting toward it, as if it was silently calling his attention. His housegirl, a young woman named Syra, had been with the family for a few years. She was quiet, hardworking, and reliable. He had never known her to panic or lose her calm. She handled her duties with precision, whether it was cleaning, cooking, or tending to small errands. But today, however, something about her seemed off. She moved slowly, almost dragging her feet. Her usual cheerful hums were absent, replaced by a tense quiet. She kept glancing towards the cabin, her hands fidgeting nervously with the corners of her apron. He noticed these small changes, but thought maybe she was just tired or worried about something minor. After all, everyone had bad days. Still, there was a subtle tension in the air he could not shake off. The sun was climbing higher, and the warmth of the morning seemed to grow heavier, almost as if it were pressing down on him. He tried to focus on his work inside the house, thinking of tasks like paperwork and organizing the kitchen, but his mind kept wandering back to the cabin and Syra's unusual behavior. At one point, he walked past her while she was sweeping the front porch. He asked casually, "Saya, are you okay? You seem a bit quiet today." She looked up at him, her eyes wide, and gave a small, forced smile. "I'm fine, sir," she said softly, almost too quickly. There was a tension in her voice that made him pause. Something in the way she avoided eye contact made his stomach twist. Breath. Normally she would have met his gaze with ease, but now it was like she was hiding something. He tried to dismiss the feeling as his imagination. Perhaps he was overthinking. After all, it was just a small change in her mood. Burst. Maybe she had an argument with someone, or maybe she had trouble at home. He had no reason to suspect anything dangerous. Breaths. Still, the unease lingered like a shadow at the edge of his thoughts. He decided to keep an eye on her but not push too hard. It was not like her to lie, but the nervous energy around her was undeniable. As the morning went on, he began to notice other small things. A chair slightly out of place near the cabin, a door left ajar when it was usually closed, the faint smell of something unfamiliar lingering in the air.
Each of these little details on its own was harmless, but together they created a sense of tension that made him uncomfortable.
He tried to ignore it, but every time he walked past the cabin, a shiver ran down his spine. The air around it felt heavier, colder somehow, even in the warmth of the day. Syra continued her work, but her movements were careful, almost hesitant. She avoided entering the cabin at all costs, stopping herself at the edge of the porch and glancing over her shoulder as if the cabin were watching. He noticed this too, and a small knot of worry formed in his chest. It was unlike her to fear a place so ordinary, filled with nothing more than old tools and boxes. He began to wonder if she had seen something small, but enough to unsettle her. Yet, when he tried to ask her directly, she would simply shake her head and say, "Nothing, sir."
I'm fine.
Bay. The man decided to give her space, thinking that pressing her too hard might only make her anxious. He returned to his office, but his concentration was gone. The soft creaks of the old house, the whisper of the wind, and the distant chirping of birds all seemed to carry a hint of something ominous. His mind wandered over every little detail of the cabin. The way the door seemed to stick slightly, the small window that let in light but cast strange shadows, the overgrown weeds around the entrance. There was something about the place today that made it feel alive, though he knew it was just a simple wooden structure. Hours passed slowly. The sunlight moved across the yard, and the warmth of the morning gave way to the brighter heat of midday. Still, he could not shake the feeling that the day had shifted. The calm that usually filled the house was replaced by a quiet tension. Every sound, the scrape of a broom, the flap of a bird's wing, the faint rustle of leaves, seemed sharper, more urgent. Even Syra's movements, normally routine, were magnified in his awareness. Her steps were light, careful, and full of hesitation, as if she expected something to appear from nowhere. Around noon, he decided to check on her. "Syra," he said gently, "why don't you take a little break?" "Go inside and have some tea." She paused, her hand on the broom, her eyes wide. I'm okay, sir," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. But even as she said it, she flinched at a sound coming from the direction of the cabin. A small creak, a subtle movement, but enough to make her step back instinctively. The man froze for a moment, listening carefully. The air felt heavier, and for a brief instant he felt a chill run through him, though the sun was still bright overhead. He told himself it was probably just the wind. Old houses made noises. Yet deep down he felt a pull toward the cabin, a need to understand why Syra was so unsettled. He began to walk slowly in that direction, each step deliberate, trying not to startle her. She followed, hesitating behind him, glancing nervously at the cabin as if expecting it to move or speak. The tension between them was palpable, a silent understanding that something was wrong, even if they didn't yet know what. Reaching the porch of the cabin, he paused. The wooden structure looked the same as always, weathered but solid. Nothing about it seemed threatening. Yet a strange feeling lingered, a mixture of curiosity and unease. He looked down at Syra. She was pale, gripping her broom tightly, her eyes darting toward the door.
"Is something inside?" he asked gently, but she could only shake her head, unable to speak.
The air between them was thick with fear, though no words had been said. It was a silent warning, an instinctual signal that this day was about to change everything. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Whatever it was, he thought, he would face it. But even as he reassured himself, the feeling of unease did not fade. It lingered, wrapping around him like a shadow, reminding him that sometimes the ordinary could hide the extraordinary, and sometimes the quiet moments were only the calm before a storm. And in that moment, as the wind whispered through the trees and the sunlight cast long shadows across the yard, he had no idea that what would happen next would be unlike anything he had ever imagined. The day had begun like any other, but the peaceful morning had quietly transformed into something heavy, something that made his chest tighten and his peace of quiet morning had stretched into early afternoon.
And the man was still trying to make sense of the uneasy feeling that had settled over the house.
He moved slowly around the rooms, his mind half on his work and half on Syra, who was now unusually silent. Normally she would hum or whistle softly as she cleaned, but today there was nothing, only the faint scrape of her broom across the floor. Every sound seemed louder than usual, echoing slightly in the empty house, making him more aware of the tension that had crept in without warning. Then, suddenly, it happened. A sharp, high-pitched scream cut through the calm air, coming from the direction of the cabin. It was raw, filled with pure fear, and it sent a shiver down his spine. For a moment he froze in place, his heart pounding. The sound was not just loud, it carried a sense of urgency that made the air itself feel heavy. His chest tightened, and he felt a cold sweat run down his back. It was a scream unlike anything he had ever heard from Syra, or anyone else. It was full of panic, desperation, and something he could not yet name.
Syra! He shouted, his voice trembling as he ran toward the cabin.
Berate. Each step felt heavier than the last. The ground under his feet seemed uneven, and his mind raced with questions. What could have caused her to scream like that? Was she hurt? Was she in danger? Every possibility ran through his head, and none of them were reassuring. As he approached the cabin, the scream stopped as suddenly as it had started. The silence that followed was almost worse than the scream itself. It was thick and suffocating, pressing down on him, making him feel exposed and vulnerable. He slowed his pace, his eyes scanning the area carefully. Nothing moved outside, but the air felt charged, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. He called out again, his voice shaking, "Syra!" "Are you okay? Please answer me."
There was no immediate response.
Only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds answered him. He stepped onto the small porch, noticing that the door to the cabin was slightly ajar. It hadn't been like that before. Usually it stayed closed unless someone entered. Bez. Now it creaked gently with the wind, adding to the tension that made his stomach twist. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had to be careful. Whatever had caused Syra to scream was inside, and he needed to approach it calmly, even if his mind was screaming at him to run. But the last thing he wanted was to startle her further, or to put himself in danger. His hand hovered over the edge of the door, hesitating. The air felt colder near the cabin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the afternoon sun outside. It was a subtle difference, but enough to make him shiver. Best. Finally, he pushed the door open slowly. The hinges groaned softly, and he could see the interior in faint detail. The cabin was small, with wooden walls and a few scattered boxes. Light filtered through a single window, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. Everything seemed in place at first glance. Nothing appeared broken or out of order. Yet there was something deeply unsettling about the stillness. It felt wrong, as if the room itself was waiting, watching. Then he saw her. Syra was standing near the corner, frozen. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her hands shook slightly, and her breath came in short, uneven gasps. She could not speak at first. Her body trembled as if she were holding back tears, though none fell. The man's heart sank. He had never seen her like this. The calm, composed woman who handled every challenge with quiet strength was now nothing more than a frightened girl in front of him. He stepped closer, his voice gentle. "Syra, it's okay. You're safe. Tell me what happened." She tried to speak, but only a small, strangled sound escaped her throat. Her eyes darted to something behind him, then back toward the shadows in the cabin. It was clear she was terrified of something, though he could not yet see what it was. He forced himself to look around carefully. At first, everything seemed normal. The boxes stacked in corners, a broom leaning against the wall, a few old tools on the shelf. But then he noticed subtle signs of disturbance. A small box was tipped over, its contents spilling onto the floor. A chair that was normally tucked neatly into a corner was now angled strangely.
There were faint scuff marks on the wooden floor, as if someone, or something, had moved quickly.
The room felt heavier, the air thicker, as if the space itself had been disturbed by an invisible force. His mind raced! Could it have been an animal? A snake? Perhaps. But then he shook his head. Nothing in the cabin's history suggested such danger. He had kept it clean, secure, and nothing like this had ever happened before. And yet, the fear in Syra's eyes was undeniable. Bess, it was not a small panic. It was a terror that spoke of something beyond ordinary explanation.
He reached out slowly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder.
Syra, look at me, he said softly. She flinched, but managed to meet his gaze. Whatever it is, we'll handle it together. You're not alone. Her lips trembled, and for a brief moment he could see the tears threatening to spill. She took a deep, shuddering breath and nodded slightly, though her eyes remained fixed on the far corner of the cabin. That corner was where his gaze was drawn next. The shadows there seemed darker than the rest, denser. Even in the afternoon light, it looked almost as if the darkness had weight. His heart pounded in his chest. Something about the way the shadows stretched across the floor made the room feel smaller, as if it were closing in on him. He felt a chill run down his spine, despite the heat outside. Every instinct screamed at him to move forward carefully, but also to prepare for the unexpected. He took a few cautious steps toward the corner, his eyes scanning for anything unusual. The closer he got, the more he noticed subtle hints. A faint stain on the floor, the way dust had been disturbed, and small items shifted out of place. It was almost imperceptible, but to him it suggested that something, or someone, had been there recently. The tension in the room was thick enough to feel on his skin. He glanced back at Syra, who had dropped to her knees, covering her face with her hands, unable to speak or move. At that moment, he realized something important. This was not a simple accident, and it was not a minor scare. Syra's scream had been genuine, triggered by something real, something that had shaken her to her core. The man's heart raced as he tried to steady himself. He had to find out what it was, for her safety and his own. But he also had to respect the fear in her eyes, the way her body trembled with the memory of whatever had happened.
He moved closer to the corner, his steps careful and deliberate.
Every sound, the creak of the floorboards under his feet, the faint rustle of leaves outside the window, felt amplified. He felt as if time had slowed, as if the moment itself was holding its breath. And then, just as he reached the threshold of that shadowed corner, he paused. Something small moved, a subtle shift, almost too faint to notice, but it was enough to make his blood. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The realization hit him slowly. Whatever had caused Syra's scream was still here, or had been here recently. It was close, hidden, waiting. And though he could not see it yet, the tension in the air told him that the cabin, which had always seemed harmless, was no longer safe. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. "Syra, stay close," he whispered. "We'll figure this out together." She nodded weakly, still trembling, but now she had some support, some reassurance. Together they stood there in the quiet, tense cabin, aware that the ordinary day had shifted into something extraordinary, something frightening. Neither of them knew what they would find, but both felt that the calm of the morning was gone forever. And in that suspended moment, the silence itself became a character, a living, pressing presence that made every heartbeat loud, every shadow threatening. The man realized that the scream had been only the beginning. Whatever waited in the cabin was patient, hidden, and capable of striking fear in anyone who dared to enter. He braced himself, knowing that the next moments could change everything. The man took a slow, steadying breath before stepping fully into the cabin. The moment he crossed the threshold, he felt the air shift around him. It was heavier, colder than the afternoon outside, and it pressed against his chest as though the small room itself were aware of his presence. Dust motes floated in the sunlight that streamed through the single window, but even they seemed to move with hesitation, as if reluctant to stir in this uneasy atmosphere. He paused just inside the door, his eyes scanning the dim interior, trying to take in every detail. Sarah stood near the far corner, her back pressed slightly against the wall. She was trembling, her small frame quivering with fear. Her hands clutched each other tightly, fingers entwined, knuckles white. Her face was pale, almost as if the color had drained from her entirely. She could not speak, could not move. Her wide eyes were fixed on a point in the room that he had not yet noticed, though instinctively he knew it must be something small, subtle, but powerful enough to terrorize her completely. He called softly, trying to reach her through the panic that had frozen her in place. "Syra, it's okay. I'm here."
"You're safe now."
His voice was calm, measured, though his own heart raced. She did not respond at first. Instead, she continued to stare, her gaze locked on the corner, her body rigid and unyielding. It was as if the fear had physically rooted her there. He moved closer, each step careful. The wooden floorboards creaked slightly under his weight, but he did not care. His eyes were fixed on Syra, trying to understand what had caused such terror. Pay. It was unlike anything he had ever witnessed before. She was usually composed, even in stressful situations, but now she was like a child who had just seen something utterly incomprehensible. Her fear was palpable, almost contagious, filling the cabin with a heavy tension that made every small sound echo unnaturally. Finally, he managed to reach her side. "Basaya, look at me. Focus on my voice," he said gently, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Breath. She flinched at first, then slowly, hesitantly, turned her head to face him. Her eyes were wide, shimmering, with unshed tears. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps, each one sounding louder in the quiet cabin than it would in a normal room. "Tell me." "What did you see?" he asked, softly, kneeling slightly so that he was closer to her level. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but only a tiny whisper emerged, barely audible. It was in the corner," she stammered. Her voice trembled, breaking with every word. I didn't touch it, I swear." She trailed off, her eyes flicking nervously to the far corner again. The man's curiosity and concern grew with every second. He forced himself to glance in the direction she was staring. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the wooden walls, a few stacked boxes, a broom leaning against a shelf. But the closer he looked, the more he noticed tiny details out of place. A box that had always been upright now lay on its side. Something small and dark rested near the wall, almost hidden in the shadow, and a faint smudge on the floor suggested it had been moved recently. It was subtle, almost invisible if one weren't paying attention, but it radiated a strange, unsettling energy. He took another careful step forward, the boards creaking softly beneath his weight. Breath. "Stay behind me," he whispered, though he knew it might not make a difference. Sarah's fear had rooted her in place, and she followed him with her eyes, still trembling. He moved slowly, methodically, his hands held out slightly as if to ward off an invisible presence. Every small sound, The rustle of leaves outside the window, the faint groan of the wooden roof, even his own breath, felt amplified in the tense atmosphere of the cabin. As he approached the far corner, he noticed more signs of disturbance. The floor was scratched in faint patterns, as if someone or something had shifted quickly. The small pile of objects that had been neatly stacked was now scattered, though there was no indication of who or what had caused it. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls, deepening as he moved closer, almost as if the darkness itself were alive. Vast. He knelt down slightly to examine the floor more closely. That was when he saw it, a small, strange object, partially hidden in the shadow. It was difficult to identify at first, a mix of shapes and textures that made it seem almost unreal. His hand hovered over it, hesitant because he knew instinctively that whatever it was had frightened Syra to her core. He could feel the tension in the room building as he lingered, the quiet stretching around them like a living thing. Syra's trembling grew more pronounced. Fast. She reached out slightly, as if wanting to touch the object but too afraid to move. Her eyes were wide, almost pleading. "Please don't," she whispered, though the sentence faltered. The man realized that whatever lay in that corner, it had affected her deeply, in a way that went beyond mere surprise or fright. It was something that had unsettled her very sense of safety, and he understood that he had to approach this carefully, without causing more panic. He took a deep breath, trying to steady both his nerves and hers. "Bess, we're going to figure this out together," he said softly. "Whatever it is, it won't hurt you." "I promise," she nodded slightly, though her body remained rigid. He could feel her heartbeat through the tense muscles of her shoulder. The fear radiating from her was intense, but it also gave him a clear sense of how serious the situation was. This was not a minor scare. This was something that had the power to terrify completely, and it had already done so. The man's eyes returned to the shadowed corner. He noticed small details that made the hairs on his arms stand up. The object was not moving, but the surrounding space seemed charged, as if it held a memory of sudden movement or a presence that had just left. The faint smell of dust and something else, something subtle but unsettling, lingered in the air. It was enough to make him cautious, to slow his movements even further, and to focus on understanding the scene before him without rushing. He motioned for Syra to take a step back, giving her some distance while he carefully examined the area. She obeyed, moving slowly, her eyes still fixed on the corner, as if daring not to look away. The tension in the room felt like a living force, pressing down on both of them. Even the sunlight streaming through the window could not ease the heaviness of the air. Every sound, every shadow, felt amplified, and the man understood that whatever had caused Syara's scream was more than just a simple scare. It had left a lasting impression on the very energy of the cabin. After a few tense moments, he slowly bent down, reaching toward the object. "Bess." Syra's hand shot out instinctively, as if to stop him, but he gently shook his head. "I'll be careful." "Just stay calm, please," he said, his voice firm but gentle. Her eyes shimmered with fear, but she nodded, her body trembling as she took a few careful steps back. As his hand hovered over the object, he could feel a strange tension in the room, almost like the air itself was holding its breath. The weight of the fear, the uncertainty, and the strange energy in the shadows pressed down on him, but he forced himself to focus. He had to understand what had caused Syra to scream, even if it was something minor or unexpected. Yet every instinct in his body warned him that this was no ordinary situation. He took another breath, steeling himself. Whatever was hidden in that corner, he realized, had transformed the ordinary into something terrifying. The cabin, once a simple storage space, had become a place of tension, fear, and unanswered questions. And he knew, deep in his mind, that discovering what lay there would change the day, and perhaps their lives, forever. The man took a slow, steadying breath, trying to prepare himself for what he might see. Every instinct in his body told him to be careful, but curiosity pushed him forward. He had to know what had caused Cyrus' scream, what had frozen her with fear, what lurked in the shadows of the cabin. The room felt smaller now, heavier, as if the walls themselves were pressing inward. Dust hung in the air, motionless, making the sunlight through the small window look sharper, harsher. Syra stayed a few steps behind him, her eyes wide, her body trembling. She did not speak, but her presence was a silent warning. Whatever was here had power over her, and perhaps over him too. The man focused on the small object in the far corner, partially hidden in the shadows. At first it looked like a simple ordinary thing, a box perhaps or an old tool, but the longer he stared, the more he realized it was something completely out of place, something that didn't belong in a quiet cabin like this. He moved closer slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. The floor creaked under his feet, and the sound seemed to echo in the tense silence. He squinted, trying to see clearly. The object was small, dark, and oddly shaped. It had an almost magnetic quality, drawing his attention despite himself. It was ordinary in size, but extraordinary in the effect it had. The way the shadows clung around it, the way it seemed to vibrate slightly in the air, subtle but undeniable. He felt a chill creep up his spine. Sarah whispered from behind him, her voice trembling. "Sir, be careful, please." He turned briefly, giving her a small, reassuring nod. "I will. Just stay calm."
I promise.
She nodded weakly, but her hands were still shaking. He could see the terror in her eyes, the same terror that had made her scream moments ago. That fear made his heart pound faster. Whatever this was, it had frightened her deeply, and now it was his turn to confront it. Finally, he reached out, his hand hovering over the object.
It felt wrong, even from a distance.
A strange tension filled the air, making the room feel alive in a way that was uncomfortable. The man's mind raced with questions. Could it be something dangerous? Could it be a trap? Or was it something so simple that it was impossible to believe it could scare someone so much? His rational mind fought with his instincts. Something about the way the shadows gathered around it, the faint disturbance on the floor, and the sheer fear in Syra's eyes told him that this was no ordinary object. Taking another cautious step, he leaned closer and finally picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, solid but not large. The moment his fingers touched it, he felt a jolt of cold that ran up his arm, as if the object carried some silent energy. Syra gasped softly behind him, covering her mouth with her hands. He could not see clearly yet what it was, only that it was unusual, unsettling, and deeply disturbing.
He lifted it into the light.
It was a small old box, carved from dark wood. The surface was worn and scratched, but the carvings on it were strange, unlike anything he had seen before. Patterns twisted and turned in ways that seemed almost alive. The more he looked, the more uneasy he felt. It was an ordinary object, yet somehow it radiated something extraordinary, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He realized why Sarah had screamed. It was not just fear of an object, but fear of what it represented. Syra finally found her voice, a trembling whisper. I didn't open it. I just, saw it move by itself. Her words were broken, hesitant, but they made sense of the terror in her eyes. The man looked down at the box again. It seemed ordinary in his hands, but her reaction told him it had caused a moment of true fear. Burl. Something about the box's presence, its subtle movement, or maybe even the shadows around it had made her panic. He set the box carefully on the floor, backing away slightly. He could feel the tension in the room pressing on him like a weight. The shadows seemed darker now, more defined, and the air had grown colder, heavier, almost as if the cabin itself were responding to the attention being paid to the object. Every instinct screamed at him to leave it alone, but curiosity and concern for Syra pushed him forward. He had to understand what it was, to see if it was dangerous, and to reassure her that she was safe. Syra moved closer, cautiously, her fear still palpable. "Despair, sir. I don't think it's just a box," she whispered. Her voice quivered, and he could see her fighting against the urge to run from the cabin entirely. Her words only added to the mystery. If it wasn't just a box, then what was it? Why had it terrified her so completely? And how long had it been here, hidden in the shadows, waiting? He knelt down beside the box, examining the carvings more closely. They were intricate, strange, and unfamiliar. Twisting patterns formed shapes that seemed almost alive under the sunlight, filtering through the window. The more he studied them, the more he felt an unease creeping up his spine. Something about the designs suggested history, secrecy, and an energy that didn't belong in a quiet, peaceful cabin. Repale, the realization made him swallow hard. Whatever this was, it had a story, and that story was tied to fear. Saya, still standing a few feet away, finally spoke again. I didn't want to touch it, but it was like it. It wanted me to see it, to know it was here. Her words made him pause. The idea that the object had wanted something was strange, almost impossible, yet her fear was undeniable. She had reacted as though it had life, as though it had intention. The man's heart raced. He had never believed in objects having power, but the fear in her eyes was real, and it demanded respect. He carefully lifted the box, holding it in both hands. It felt heavier than before, almost as if the weight of the unknown pressed down through the wood. Desperado. He glanced around the cabin, noticing again the small signs of disturbance. The scuff marks, the tipped-over box. The dust moved slightly, as if in anticipation. Every detail confirmed what he already suspected. Something about this box had disturbed the balance of the room, had unsettled the air itself. Finally, he set the box down on a small table near the window, letting sunlight fall directly on it. The carving seemed less threatening in the light, but the tension in the air remained. He looked at Syra, who had taken a hesitant step closer, still trembling. "It's safe now," he said softly. "Nothing is going to hurt you." "I promise." She nodded slowly, though her eyes continued to flick nervously to the shadows around the corner. The terror had not fully left her, and he understood why. The unknown has a power ordinary objects can never match. For a long moment, they simply stared at the box together, the cabin silent except for their shallow breaths. The man's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had discovered. It was real, tangible, yet terrifying, not because of its size or appearance, but because of its effect. Syra's scream, the frozen fear, the tension in the air, all of it pointed to something extraordinary hidden in what appeared to be an ordinary box. He finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "We need to be careful. We need to understand it, but we cannot let fear control us." Syra nodded, wiping her hands on her apron, though her body still trembled. Together they had confronted the unknown. the object that had turned an ordinary cabin into a place of terror, and they had survived the first wave of its power. Yet both of them knew the moment was only the beginning. The cabin, the box, and the shadows it had stirred held more secrets, secrets that would take courage, patience, and careful thought to uncover. And in that quiet, tense moment, the man realized something important. Fear could be overwhelming, even paralyzing, but understanding could be stronger. He had faced the scream, approached the frozen house girl, and uncovered the object that had caused such terror. The day had shifted from ordinary to extraordinary, and now they both understood that life could change in a single moment, bringing fear, uncertainty, and revelation all at once.